that you can do as an individual to try to help protect the amazing seagrass resources that we have here in the Nature Coast. And I don't know if you noticed on that map, but the Nature Coast is actually one of the areas that has some of those red dots. So we really need to be careful and not get complacent. Just because it's called the Nature Coast doesn't mean that it's all nature and doesn't get impacted by urban areas and other things happening in the watershed. So we already mentioned the pledges. Those are really great, and you can win a prize if you take the pledge. And there are additional prizes that I'll draw later in the summer for anyone who wants to take. So we have a scalloping best practices one and a seagrass safe boating one. And those are available online, so I can send those out to the Facebook feed later. And also Florida-friendly landscaping. If you haven't ever interacted with this program or with your local IFAS extension office, they can really help you a lot with low-impact landscaping choices. You know, things like rain gardens, rain barrels, and then there's all kinds of other things you can do. Citizen science, coastal cleanups. I have vote up there. You can take from that what you will. But each of these individual actions really does matter. And there's lots of things that we can do, even as people that don't live right on the water, to help protect seagrasses and make sure that their secrets stay safe forever. Yeah. Okay, so if you want to hear more from the Nature Coast Biological Station about what we do, we have all 3 social media accounts. And also Florida Sea Grant has a great active social media. And we do a lot of activity on there. And we also have several events throughout the year. We have an open house coming up in September where we're going to have all the research on show for people to come out and see what we do out there in the Nature Coast at the Biological Station. So thanks for your time, and definitely please have a look at the seagrass specimens. And I think there might be some urchins back there. I'm not sure. And I am also happy to take questions. All right, so this hand was first and then you.
Grasses are relatively recently evolved, so grass has a new on Earth. Are seed grass more ancient than grassland?
Okay, so the question was, are seagrass beds more ancient than grasslands? And I have to honestly say that I do not know the answer to that question. In that evolutionary tree, seagrasses appear to split off earlier than the land grasses all the way on the far right period, but I don't know by how much, and I also don't know which species may have survived out of those different lineages. So based on that graph, I think that it would be true, but I don't actually know myself the answer to that question. So right here was the next one.
As far as seagrasses produce oxygen, how important is that to the coastal oxygenation of the water?
Okay, so the question was, how important is the oxygen that seagrasses produce to just the general oxygen budget of coastal waters? And the answer is that depends. So some seagrasses have a positive or an autotrophic oxygen budget, meaning that when you subtract the respiration that the seagrasses themselves have, there's more oxygen produced than is consumed. But it's also been shown that some seagrass meadows can basically break even on that, because at night they're not photosynthesizing. So they're just basically using up oxygen during the night and not photosynthesizing to make up for that. And so in some meadows that balance is even in the negative. And in some meadows it's in the positive. So they can, especially in sediments, make a big difference in the oxygen, but it varies a lot in terms of the actual water column oxygen. So we did have a question online. Did you say, Becca? Okay, well, we'll take, I think I saw Tommy next.
Savannah, you and I talked about this before, the difference between eelgrass and turtle grass, freshwater, saltwater. And at what point in the river system does freshwater make a difference in terms of the way turtle grass grows?
Okay, so the question is the difference, there were actually 2 questions, eelgrass versus turtle grass. So there are freshwater in our springs. If you've ever been to the springs and you've seen grasses that look very much like the pictures I've been showing, that's a different species. It's usually Vallisneria americana, but there are other Sagittaria, other species. But lots of people call that eelgrass or tape grass, or even wild celery, I think is other common name for that. And so those grasses are different. They're actually in a different family in many cases from the seagrasses, but they're very closely related, and they also share that same from being land plants that evolved back. So that is a similarity. And then the other part of the question was about salinity and when do you start to see that transition basically from freshwater grasses to true seagrasses. And that really depends on the salinity tolerance of the grass. So some people consider rupia or widgeon grass to be a seagrass because you find it in salty environments, but it's actually not a true seagrass. It's in that same group with it was labeled pond weeds on that slide, which I think is hilarious, but anyway. So that's like gonna be a grass that's gonna start to thrive around 5 to 10 parts per thousand. You're gonna see it. And there are some seagrasses that can do okay at 10-ish, but you're not really gonna see them start to be dominant until something closer to like pushing 20 or maybe even up to full seawater is where they're happiest. But there are some that can be in that estuarine zone, yeah. Oh, I lost track of who was next, but you've had your hand up for a while back there.
Soil profiles.
Mm-hmm.
Do these submerged sediments exhibit the same complexity?
Okay, so the question's about soil profiles and how complex they are in marine environments. So when you say that, do you mean just like changes in texture or like geologic?
Well, it's described as a very slow rate of recolonization of certain soils. Terrestrial systems don't exhibit that.
Right. Well, so the recolonization, so, okay. All right. I'll try to answer your first question and I'll get to the recolonization. So sediment profiles do vary in lots of these submerged habitats. It all depends obviously on the rate of sediment in the water. So actually in the nature coast, we have very low inputs of sediment because most of the rivers are spring fed. And so we get very low, we don't get a high stacking up of sediments in that area. But we do see differences in density and grain size as we go down. Right near the top, it's a very biologically active zone. There's a lot of little things digging and resuspending. And so that's a very loose sediment. And as the further you go down, the more tightly packed it's going to be. And that kind, and organic matter.
The hydrogen sulfide is
It can, but the seagrasses do a lot towards combating that. And the bioturbation and all the turnover of that is introducing oxygen into that upper sediment zone. So that the sulfates are very high and sulfide can be high, but directly next to the seagrass tissues where it matters, it isn't. And there are variations in how deep seagrass roots can go. Like I think Thalassia has been shown to have roots down to at least 1 meter is the deepest that I've seen. There are some others that can have roots even deeper than that, like in the Mediterranean, they have a very large species of seagrass. But most of the seagrass roots in this area don't go deeper than about, I don't know, I'm thinking in centimeters, about 12 to 15 centimeters. So I think that's something like 6 to 8 inches. I'm not sure about that though. Okay, did that answer? And then the slow it could get there, yeah. Yeah, and then also the slow recolonization rate is related to the fact that seagrasses are evolved. They can reproduce sexually through their flowers, but they can also do vegetative propagation through their rhizomes and make a lot of new shoots that way. But they can only go sideways or up with their rhizomes. They can't go down. So when you have a propeller scar, you have a trench that's down, and they just cannot grow down into that. They're just not adapted to do that. Yeah. So, okay, online question.
Yes. Both Virginia and Maria are asking, with the actual rise of sea levels along the Florida coast, will we expect to see seagrass population distribution change as well?
Okay, so the question was about sea level rise. Will seagrass distribution change with that? Well, a lot of that's going to depend on coastal squeeze. I mean, in theory, seagrasses will just move with the depth that they can survive at, which is related to the light that's reaching the bottom. So if there are seagrasses, let's say on the very deepest edge, way out on the shelf, that 1 inch of difference in depth is going to make the difference between them living or dying, then yes, they may retreat inland, but or on that edge, but the inward migration of seagrasses is going to be a completely different issue because there are going to be lots of variations in human infrastructure next to the coast and how much of that is going to become available for seagrasses to colonize. But in theory, they're just going to follow that band of light that would allow them to survive.
Does ocean acidification have any effect on seagrass beds?
Okay, does ocean acidification have any effect on seagrass beds? This is a great question, and I was trying to go past my nutrient cycling slide fast because I didn't want you guys to fall asleep or leave the room. But so there was a slide on there. If you were quick, you probably noticed that the carbon cycle was mentioned in blue carbon deposition. So seagrasses do a great job at absorbing a lot of carbon and holding a lot of carbon in their sediments and keeping it there for a long time. And that varies, of course, from meadow to meadow. But ocean acidification is an interesting one with seagrasses because there have been those that have hypothesized that seagrasses could actually serve as a refuge from ocean acidification because they take up so much carbon dioxide that they could actually raise the pH locally and help out those calcifying organisms that are going to suffer from that. And for folks that aren't, ocean acidification is just the fact that we have a lot of carbon dioxide in our atmosphere. A large portion of that is actually going into the ocean, and it can affect the ability of things that build shells to build their shells well, especially at younger life stages, juveniles and little things that happen to live in seagrass meadows a lot. So that it has been shown that in some certain contexts, seagrasses can be a refuge from ocean acidification, especially when there's slow water flow and when it's one of those meadows that has a positive respiration budget. Because remember, respiration is going to release CO2. So it's a tricky issue, but it's out there and a lot of people are really interested in looking into that. But if you were to look at it just straight on its face, more carbon dioxide in the water would actually benefit seagrasses because they need carbon for their photosynthesis, and they actually end up a lot of times using a less efficient carbon source than direct carbon dioxide. So there have been hypothesized that they would benefit from ocean acidification, seagrasses would, because they don't build shells. Okay, so can seagrass be planted or transplanted into areas that have been scarred? And the answer is yes. It's very costly to do so. So there are lots of programs that have looked at ways to restore propeller scars. And on our Facebook, we have a video about some of the work we're doing with that. But the main way to do it is you bring in like a long cotton tube of sand to bring that scar back up level so the rhizomes can sort of recolonize, but you can plant little plugs of grass within there, but it's something like $3 per linear foot to do that. So it's very cost prohibitive. So it's always better to prevent damage, but there are lots of other larger scale restoration efforts with seed broadcasting, and Tampa Bay has been very successful in restoring their seagrass just by correcting water quality issues. So sometimes planting isn't even necessary. Sometimes you can just fix the original stressor, and that does well. So yeah, good question. I didn't talk at all about restoration. Rick.
What kind of seagrass will I find in scallops?
So I think with that, so the question is in what kind of seagrass are you going to find the most scallops? And I've had the most luck in areas that are mixed turtle and manatee grass, that the scallops seem to like a little bit of heterogeneity, especially if there's some clumps of macroalgae hanging out in that area. I've had good success with that. But in general, scallops seem to follow a salinity band when they're at harvest, that adult size that you would be worth harvesting. If we get a lot of rain and there's a lot of fresh water close to the coast, those scallops are going to try to move farther away. So they can be even in bare sand next to seagrass meadows too. So it's not necessarily going to be any one type of seagrass meadow, but those tips I gave you, let me know if they work.
So they'll get up and move. Not that it's not a development issue. All the species get up and move.
So the scallops can't move very far though. They will try to move, but if like a big slug of fresh water comes out and it's way too fast for them to be able to move, they will die from that. They really like salty water. They don't like brackish at all. So yeah, and they can kind of move around within a meadow, but they're not going to be like migrating to. No, probably not. Yeah, I don't know exactly what their limit is, but it's not far.
So you mentioned a few things about climate change, but I was hoping you could address it more. You didn't mention anything about
Okay, so other climate change, we talked a little bit about ocean acidification and sea level rise, but what about warming? So you saw that example in Florida Bay where there was a lot of evaporation, a lot of hypersalinity. Part of that's due to modified freshwater input, but part of that can also be related to temperature because that temperature does exacerbate that hydrogen sulfide formation and it just further stresses the seagrass. So in terms of temperature changes in the water and in the coastal environment, we usually tend to think about range shifts of species. So we're seeing the arrival of grazers that haven't necessarily been present in our more subtropical or even temperate seagrass meadows. So things like parrotfish that we think of only as occurring in the Caribbean that actually feed on seagrass blades. So that's a new grazer that's coming in, and we actually have a project looking at the effects of that going on right now all throughout the Gulf. We're involved in a Smithsonian-led multi-institutional project looking at warming effects. So that's one. And then you see other things like that maybe don't necessarily graze on the seagrass, but that are novel predators, like mangrove snappers and things that never used to be up in the panhandle and things like that, or at least not in the numbers that they are now. There's several other examples. So we call that tropicalization when we see range shifts of species that are coming farther north and then they're part of the food web. They're grazing on things, they're feeding on things that maybe aren't used to having that around. So that can be one thing, but then also the sea level rise question, I got the sense that one was more about inward outward migration of seagrass, but we're pretty near the northern range limit for some of the seagrass species that we have here in Florida. And so then as we see temperatures warm, we could start to see those seagrasses move north, more and more north, because the more temperate species, Zostra marina, is the one that they have in Virginia and North Carolina, but they could start to see tropicalization in those meadows and that they actually may get different seagrass species coming in. So there's a lot of levels to the temperature change, and then, you know, temperature affects respiration rates, and so it can start to offset that balance between oxygen versus CO2 production. So you may start to see dissolved oxygen budgets be more and more stressed, and fish kills occur more easily and things like that. But, you know, there are warmer waters that survive just fine and have seagrass meadows and everything. So it's all, there's going to be a transition period and there's going to be winners and losers for sure. So, yep, back there. Okay, so is there any comparative research going on from seagrasses here to seagrasses in the Mediterranean versus? Okay, so well, there was that one study I mentioned where right now the big trend in seagrass research is to get a bunch of people together from across the globe and all do the same experiment in your local seagrass meadows. So there's a project called Bite Map that literally used something called a squid pop, which is just a punched out piece of dried squid tied to monofilament. And they deployed these out in seagrass meadows all across the world to look at effective predation rates in temperate versus tropical seagrass meadows. There have also been ones where we put different types of tea, like a tea bag, and buried them in sediments all across the world with seagrass meadows to look at decomposition rates, look at carbon storage rates globally. So the answer is yes, and those are just two of the examples I know of, but more and more of these networks are being formed where institutions are doing these huge, directly comparable experiments all across the world.
So there's a lot of news about microplastics, and has anyone been looking at that off the Gulf Coast and the Seagrass Beds, and are there areas that are the most guilty for causing that along our coastline?
Okay, so the question is about microplastics, and is anyone looking at it in this area? As far as I know, the Big Bend Aquatic Preserve staff are monitoring microplastics in the water column in this area. And there is a statewide project. You've probably seen the Florida Microplastics Awareness Project. There's actually citizen science network all across Florida of people taking samples. I don't know if the research is set up in a way to identify the sources, and I'm fairly certain that they probably wouldn't feel comfortable attempting to use the data for that. But we know that the major sources of microplastics are actually our clothing, not so much our personal care products anymore, especially because the EPA has legislated those out of the supply stream, or at least it's in certain ways. There's still loopholes in that law. It's not perfect, but synthetic clothing is actually the largest source of microplastics. So that's one other thing you can do, is try to choose more natural fibers, only wash your clothes when they're dirty, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Well, oysters are much higher microplastic burden for consumption because you need to digest it. So compared to scallops, I don't need to get that.
Yeah, and that would be true for any contaminant. And so the comment was that oysters and clams and shellfish, that you eat the entire mollusk versus scallops, where you just eat the mussel, you would have a higher risk of consuming microplastics. Although there is a study that came out that showed that mussels were very effective at spitting microplastics out. So don't sell oysters short just yet. Dorothy, did you have a question?
I did. I wanted to know historically, are we on uptrend for seagrass meadows, or are seagrass meadows on the decline?
Globally or in Florida? Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, globally, the estimate is that we lose a soccer field size worth of seagrass every, couple, I don't know how, it's a lot. It's a fast rate. I can't exactly remember. I don't want to misquote it, but yeah, globally, we're losing seagrasses. They're among the most threatened types of habitats on Earth. Their rates of loss are on par with coral reefs and rainforests. So yeah, globally, we are losing seagrass, although in Florida, you saw there was a lot of positive things to feel positive about, although the red dots are in our biggest reserves of seagrass. So let's not forget that too.
Last question.
Huh?
How would you rate the audience on such a question?
This is awesome. I thought people were just gonna run off and get another beer. This is so great. You're
No, I
making me
can't-
feel-
can't cut
I
you
wanted
off.
to just give you a teaser in the slides, and then you could, yeah, that's a good, back there, yeah.
Are any sort of methods globally trying to remote sensing techniques, either airborne or satellite, to try and track over time these habitats and figures, what's going on consistently?
Yeah, so the question is, are there remote sensing, things like satellite and aerial imagery to track seagrass trends? And the answer is yes, although I don't know of anyone who's doing it all across the globe. I think these efforts are more piecemeal. Like for instance, here in Florida, a lot of our state agencies use aerial imagery to track, but there's lots of cool stuff coming out right now, like looking at the exact spectral signature of seagrass so that they don't get confused with maybe say kelp or another photosynthetic organism that's below the water, where they can actually key in like on the specific beta carotene reflectance and all of the things that seagrass have going on. And there are people that are working on that. I see lots of articles coming out on that. So remote sensing is definitely in use in Florida and globally, but it probably could be used more. Sorry? Yes, you can, yeah, I'm sure, with the reflectance rates and all of that kind of stuff. So it's all very technical, but it's great. Do you do remote sensing? Is that your thing? Okay, cool.
All right.
If someone gave you $100,000, what would you do?
We're getting too far out there.
Yeah, that someone said drink more beer. That's a good note to end on. So we're gonna do a drawing now.
Yeah. So if everyone could give Savanna a round of applause. Thank you so much. And we're gonna thank Cypress and Grove one more time and say goodbye to our Facebook Live because they're not here to win the raffle. So if anyone filled out a pledge that wasn't able to turn it in yet, you can do that now.